Assalamualaikum first year. Today we will cover the functions of skin, uh, which include its function as a protective covering and then its role in temperature regulation. And we will also cover the synthetic, absorptive, and immune functions of skin, and then we will move on to specialized accessory structures of skin as well as their functions. So let's start. You know that external environment is inherently hostile, and it contains a number of elements which are capable of causing tissue damage. So our body must erect a barrier to protect itself. And the protective function of skin is achieved by its working as a physical and a biological barrier, and also through the waterproofing and the presence of melanin. Now, the outer barrier against the bacterial entry, that is provided by keratin. And our skin barrier, it also impedes the passage into the body of toxic chemicals that come into contact with the body surface. You see, in many instances, the skin, it modifies the compounds that come in contact with it. For example, the epidermal enzymes, they can convert many potential carcinogens into harmless compounds. However, some materials, especially the lipid soluble substances, they can penetrate intact skin through the lipid bilayers of plasma membranes of epidermal cells. Now, right. So, how our skin provides protection through waterproofing? This waterproofing is provided by the keratin and the lipid content of skin. You already know that the epidermal cells, they are riveted tightly together by the desmosomes, and these desmosomes, they interconnect with the intracellular keratin filaments to form a strong and cohesive covering. And what happens that during the maturation of keratin producing cells, the keratin filaments, they progressively accumulate and they cross link with one another within the cytosol. And as the outer cells, they die, this fibrous keratin core, it remains there, and it forms a flattened, hardened scale. And these scales, they provide a tough keratinized layer. Now, as the scales of the outermost keratinized layer, they slough or they flake off through abrasions, they at the same time they are continuously replaced by means of cell division in the deeper epidermal layers. Now, the rate of the cell division and consequently the thickness of this keratinized layer, it varies in different regions of body. um, you can say that it is thickest in the areas where the skin is subjected to most pressure, such as in the bottom of feet. Now, this keratinized layer, you see, it is airtight, and it is also fairly waterproof, and it is impervious to most the substances. So it resists anything passing in either direction between body and the external environment. For example, it functions as a water resistive shield, much like a car wax, which causes water to bead on the epithelial surface and minimizes the loss of water and other vital constituents from body. And then it prevents most foreign material from penetrating into the body. So why this waterproofing is so important? You see, the protective layer's value in holding the body fluids inside, it becomes obvious after severe burns, because in case of a burn, the bacterial infections, they can occur in the unprotected underlying tissue. But apart from these infections, um, even more serious are the systemic consequences of the loss of body water and the plasma proteins, because this water and plasma proteins, they escape from the exposed burnt surface. So this loss, it results in the circulatory disturbances which could be life threatening. And in addition to that, burn patients, they have increased transepithelial water loss from the skin, and this loss, it can challenge the fluid homeostasis in case a sufficiently large area of the body surface that is involved. And uh, for these reasons, the burnt areas, they are often wrapped with bandages to supplement the physical barrier function of the skin when it is not present there. And also the topical antibiotics, they are applied as the antimicrobial shield. So this is how our skin, it acts as a uh, physical and biological barrier, but it has other protective effects also, which are because of the presence of melanin and certain immune cells. Melanin protects from the harmful rays, and this biological barrier, it is provided uh, by the Langerhans cells which are present in the epidermis. I already told you about these cells. And in the dermis, there are macrophages and mast cells which provide this immunological function. Now, this was the function of skin as a protective covering. One of the important functions of skin is the temperature regulation. Now, this thermoregulation, uh, it is done by altering the skin circulation. For example, if the body temperature is higher, then our skin helps in losing the heat by conduction, convection, and radiation. But keep in mind that for these processes, the conduction, convection, and radiation, there must be a difference in the body temperature and the ambient temperature. But when the body temperature becomes equal to the ambient temperature, then our skin helps in losing heat through sweating and evaporation. So this is how our skin, it plays a major role in thermoregulation. Then skin also has got synthetic function, because the epidermis, it synthesizes the vitamin D. And how does it do it? That Inactive vitamin D, this is present in the skin, and it gets converted into the activated form by the exposure to the sunlight. Although the cell type which produces the vitamin D, that is undetermined yet. And why vitamin D is important? You already know that the vitamin D that is required for bone homeostasis, because it promotes absorption of calcium from the digestive tract into the blood. And why supplementation of vitamin D is required? Because usually skin is not exposed to sufficient sunlight to produce adequate amounts of this essential chemical. The next is the absorptive function of skin. There are various substances which can be absorbed through skin surface, such as there are some drugs which can be absorbed by skin, such as nicotine or estrogens. So these drugs, they are sometimes used in the form of cutaneous patch which is impregnated with that drug. But there are certain harmful chemicals also. For example, the organophosphorus compounds present in the insecticides, they can be absorbed through skin, and the farmers, they get affected, and the systemic effects, they are produced if the massive amounts of these chemicals, they are absorbed through skin, and this could be life threatening also. So these were some of the important functions of skin, as protective covering, and the synthetic and absorptive functions, and also skin's role in the temperature regulation. Right. So now our skin, it has got accessory structures also, which are hair and glands. Here, they act as an insulator layer, and then there are sebaceous glands, which are attached to the hair follicles. Now, how these sebaceous glands, they help? These sebaceous glands, they have oily secretions. They release the sebum, and this oily secretion of sebum, it contains mono, di, and triglycerides, and various esters such as the sterol esters and wax esters. Now these oily secretions, they make the skin and hair greasy and soft, and these sebaceous secretions, they increase during puberty. And as far as the location is concerned, these sebaceous glands, they are more numerous on face and scalp, while they are absent on palms and soles. Right. So now there is a very important function of skin, that it provides receptors for different body sensations, for the reception of these sensory stimuli. Touch, temperature, and pain receptors, they are present on the skin, and that is to keep us oriented about the environment. There are Meissner's corpuscles, which are there for the detection of light touch. And these corpuscles, they are egg shaped. They are located in the dermal papillae, and they populate the areas in the fingertips, palms, soles, eyelids, and the tip of tongue. And then come the Pacinian corpuscles, which are the receptors for pressure detection. They have a very peculiar shape. They are onion shaped, and they are located in the deep dermis and the subcutaneous regions. And finally, our skin, it has got a lot of free nerve endings, which also respond to the temperature changes and to the factors which can damage the tissues. And these free nerve endings, they also extend into the epidermis. So this is how our skin has a role in the sensory system also. Then comes the immunological function of our skin, because antigen presenting and the antigen phagocytosing cells, they are present in the skin. And these cells, as I already told you, these cells are called Langerhans cells. And these Langerhans cells, they interact with T helper cells in immune responses. Apart from all these functions, there are some other functions of skin. Uh, you see that epidermal cells, the keratinocytes, they show the property of healing and repair. And many drugs and chemicals, they can be excreted through skin in the dilution of sweat. And milk secretion, that is also considered a function of skin, because the mammary glands, they actually are modified sweat glands. So how the skin, it performs the function of inactivation of the chemicals. You see, a small amount of testosterone, that is also inactivated to the estrogen in the skin. And then our skin, it also acts as a minor blood reservoir, because our dermis, it houses about 10% of body's blood vessels, but skin itself, it requires only 1 to 2% of body's blood. So all in case of emergency, the skin blanches and there is vasoconstriction, and all this extra blood, that is thrown to the systemic circulation. And then skin is helpful because the skin manifestations of various diseases, they can be helpful for various diagnosis. Now we will move on to the specialized accessory structures of skin, which originate from dermis, and they include hair and hair follicles, nails, and very important are skin glands. So we will cover them one by one. The base of each hair, that is attached to a piloerector muscle, and this muscle is controlled by the sympathetic nervous system. So when this muscle is stimulated to contract, the piloerector muscles, they cause hair erection, and they produce goosebumps. Now, what is? I will tell you in very small detail the hair structure. Uh, each hair that is constructed from three layers of fused keratinized cells. The outermost layer is the protective layer and it is colorless. While the middle layer, which is called cortex, now this layer it imparts strength and it contains two types of melanin and the relative proportion of which it gives hair its natural color. And the inner layer, which is the third layer, the medulla, that is present only in larger hair. And now the portion which protrudes beyond the epidermis, that is called hair shaft. And this hair shaft, it emerges from the hair follicle. Now what is a hair follicle? You see, the hair follicle, it's a specialized skin structure and it contains hair bulb and keratinocytes and associated glands. What actually happens that the epidermal cells, they form a tube-like structure and they extend into the dermis. And a bundle of erector pili smooth muscle that is associated with every hair follicle. Now each hair follicle that is lined by special keratin producing cells. These keratin producing cells, of course, they secrete keratin and other proteins that form the hair shaft. But keep in mind that these follicles, they also contain a sensory nerve fiber network. And this root plexus, it provides information about touch, pressure, and pain. Now this hair cycle, it consists of growth, rest, regression, and the shedding phase. And the duration of the growth phase, that basically determines the hair length. And this duration, it can vary from one area of the body to the next. And you know, this explains that why scalp hair, they are typically much longer than in the other regions. So now we move on to the main thing, that why hair are important. Uh, you see, body hair, they increase the sensitivity of skin surface to the tactile stimuli. And in in lower species, this function this function of increasing skin sensitivity, that is more finely tuned. For example, uh, take the example of a cat. The you see the whiskers on a cat, they are exquisitely sensitive in this regard. And not in humans, but in hairier species, this body hair, they have an even more important role in the heat conservation. Although this function is not significant in the hairless humans. Then you know that there are some forms of cancer which are treated using chemotherapy. And how does the chemotherapy works? You know that it targets rapidly dividing cells. And since this treatment is non-discriminatory, so it also affects the rapidly proliferating keratinocytes. And that is why we see hair thinning or even hair loss in the patients of chemotherapy. So we have covered one of the accessory structures, which was hair, and then come nails and skin glands. So what are nails? A nail is basically it's a epithelium which has undergone extensive keratinization, and this extensive keratinization, it helps in the protection of the ends of our digits. Nails are derived from the nail beds, and these nail beds, they are living epidermal structures. Now, what are these skin glands? Basically, these are special enfoldings of the epidermis into the underlying dermis from, um, and this is how the skin glands they are formed. And there are two types of the exocrine glands of skin, and these types are the sebaceous glands and the sweat glands. And now I will tell you about these two types one by one. The sebaceous glands, they are made up of simple cuboidal epithelium, and they are associated with the hair follicles. Now they secrete sebum and fat and some cellular material. The sebum which is secreted into the hair follicles, it flows to the skin surface. So this is how it oils both the hairs and the outer keratinized layers of skin. So we can say that the sebum, it keeps skin and hair soft, pliable, and virtually waterproof. And it is the sebum which prevents the skin from drying and cracking. So if you see chapped hands or chapped lips, basically they indicate insufficient protection by the skin sebum. And many of you might have suffered oily skin during your teenage years, because these sebaceous glands, they are particularly active during adolescence. So I will repeat again. So what do the sebaceous glands do? They release sebum, and because of this sebum, the skin and the hair, they are kept oiled and soft. Well, so this is one type of the exocrine glands of skin. The other type is the sweat glands. These sweat glands, they are distributed over most of the body, and they release dilute salt solution through small openings onto the skin surface, and these openings, they are called the sweat pores. Now the evaporation of this sweat, it cools the skin, and that is why these glands, they are important in regulating the temperature. Now the amount of sweat which is produced by these sweat glands, that can be controlled, and now the amount, that depend on certain factors such as the environmental temperature, or the amount of heat generated by the skeletal muscle activity, and also the amount of the sweat, that is controlled by various emotional factors. For example, a person often sweats more when he or she is nervous. Now there are two types of these sweat glands, and this classification has been based on the composition of their secretion. These two types of the sweat glands, these are eccrine glands and the apocrine glands. So first let's talk about the eccrine glands. These eccrine glands, they are coiled in deep dermis, and their ducts, they pass through the dermis to open at the surface through a pore. And now I'm going to tell you a very important thing, that these eccrine glands, they respond only to the elevated temperature or the exercise. There are certain other features also of these eccrine glands, that their secretion, it has no odor, and these glands, they function throughout life, starting from the birth. And the presence of these eccrine glands, that is not associated with the hair follicles, and they are located at the forehead, at the neck, and at the back. And their secretion consists of water, salts, and certain wastes such as urea and uric acid. Now, in contrast to these eccrine glands, there are apocrine glands also. Now, these apocrine glands, they have got the ducts which terminate into the hair follicles. And keep in mind that these apocrine glands, they respond to stress and to emotions, and their secretion, unfortunately, it has got odor. Now these glands, these apocrine glands, they begin to function at puberty, and then they continue throughout the life. These glands are located in the axillary, pubic regions, and also in the groin. And since their secretion is protein rich, so this protein content, it supports the growth of the surface bacteria, which gives rise to characteristic odor. Now, the other components of the secretion of apocrine glands are water, oil, and some cellular debris. So it means the odor, that becomes quite messy. But in contrast to these apocrine glands and the sweat, most of the sweat, and as well as the secretions from the sebaceous glands, they all contain chemicals which are generally highly toxic to bacteria. So that's a relief. Since we are talking about all the you see the messy things about the apocrine glands and sweat, so let's cover this common adolescent disorder which also occur in adults. You might have heard about the whiteheads. So what are these whiteheads? They are actually closed comedo acne pimples, and they occur when the skin cells, they block our hair follicles external opening. So what happens, that sebum, it becomes a trap, but it continues to be produced. So finally the bacteria, they colonize the accumulating sebum, and they cause local inflammation, and this is how it results into acne. There are certain drugs which reduce the sebum secretions, for example, the retinoids, and they can help in controlling the acne occurrence and also in its spread. And then there are some modified sweat glands, which are the ceruminous glands and the mammary glands. Mammary glands, they secrete milk, while the ceruminous glands, they are present in the external ear, and their secretion is ear wax. So that was all about the functions of skin and the accessory structures of skin and their functions. So here we wrap the skin physiology, and next time we will move on to the body temperature regulation.